Today's book of the Bible, Ezra. Ezra. Now before we have a look at Ezra, let's remember what's happened so far. So God's people used to have a king. And they lived in Israel, that's this whole area here. And the capital of Israel was Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem there was a temple where they went to worship God. But we've seen that God's people kept sinning again and again so badly that after a long time God sent enemies to invade them. First there was a civil war in the country and it split in two, and then the Assyrian army came, and then the Babylonian army came to attack. And what happened when they attacked is, well, that Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. The king, well, he was taken away. And the people were taken away to a foreign land in exile. Oh dear. So that's what's happened. But God made a promise. He promised that one day the people would return from exile and that they would rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. He even promised that he would use a foreign king, a king called Cyrus, to help them do that. Well, they had to wait a while, but that's exactly what happened. And we read about this return and rebuilding in Ezra and Nehemiah. We'll look at Nehemiah next week. So Cyrus, he's a king of Persia. He defeated Babylon and he tells the people, you can go home. He gives them back all the gold and the silver for the temple. And a group of people decide to come back to Jerusalem to rebuild. And as we read about this rebuilding, we see two things that they rebuilt and restored. The first thing we see is the temple. They rebuild the temple. Now they actually start with the altar. This is the place where they sacrifice animals to God, where they come to worship him. Out of everything, even before they build the city, they build the altar and the temple first. Worship of God comes first above everything else to the people, so they can receive God's forgiveness and have his presence with them. So they build the altar so they can make these sacrifices of animals, and they lay the foundations of the new temple. Now before a building is built, you have to make sure the ground is solid, don't you? So nowadays if you're building a building, they dig a big hole first and they fill it with concrete to make it solid, and then they mark out where you put the walls and the doors and the windows. They build the foundations to build onto. Well, that's sort of what they did with the temple. They built just the bottom, the foundations. They marked out where it would go. And over the years, this temple was going to be built. It was going to take time, but it was going to grow and be built. But they'd started the work. How exciting! And they played music and they praised God. They said, He's good, He's good. His love to Israel endures forever. But you know what else happened when they were singing about this new temple? Some of the older people were a bit sad. They were crying, because they remembered the old temple and they thought this new one isn't as good. It's not as big. They were sad. So that's the first thing they rebuild, the temple with the altar to meet with God. The second thing that gets rebuilt is the community of people. A couple more people come back as well. And we see God's community growing. In Ezra, there's loads of lists of people. It's a bit like a register. So I don't know if you still have this, but when I was at school, I used to go to school in the morning and the teacher used to have a register and they'd call everyone's name and everyone would say, yes, I'm here. But if someone was in the room and their name wasn't in the register, they were in the wrong place. They got told to go to the other class where they belonged. And when you're on the register of a class, you belong to that class, don't you? You've got your own teacher, your own leader, and you belong to that community. Well, that's a bit like what happens in Ezra. There's a list of all the families who belong to Israel, who belong to God, and they come together as a community. They've got leaders, and they pray together, and they worship God together, and they all give their time and their money and their skills to rebuild together. They work together. They're a team. So that's what we see. We see the temple and the community. Now there are a couple of problems that we come across in Ezra. First of all, there's danger. The people around them are opposing them. They don't want them to rebuild. And so the people are in danger, but they pray to God and God protects them. The second problem we see in Ezra is the people's sin. God has told them to be separate from the people around them. Because all the way back in, remembering Judges, they got led astray when they married the peoples and the religions around them and they abandoned God and forgot God. But God says, don't let that happen again. Stay separate. Don't marry with the religions around you. But they ignored God. They married of all the religions around them. They followed their gods rather than God. And Ezra tells them off. He says you need to say sorry to God. And so they do. They say, sorry God, please forgive us. So that's Ezra. That's what happens in Ezra. We're going to see how that continues next week in Nehemiah. But what can we learn from Ezra? Well, we learn that God rules everything and he keeps his promise. God promised they'd come back, didn't he? God promised they'd rebuild. And God uses the kings of the world and everything that goes on to make sure he keeps his promises, to make sure that happens, even despite the opposition of the people around. And Christians are people who believe God will keep his promise to forgive them, to bring them to heaven, where there'll be a community that worship God together. When we trust Jesus, we're included and involved in God's plan, in God's promises. And Christians meet together now as God's community. Christians contribute their time and their money and their talents to worship God.